Today's topic is something that I've always wanted to make a video about, and it's whether or not Denver's high altitude gives their sports teams an unfair advantage. Now, a while back, I made a video talking about home court advantage in general in the NBA, and one of the main takeaways from that video is that, well, there are many factors that explain why every single NBA team, and in fact every single sports team, does better at home than on the road. So in this video, we're first going to cover why high altitude matters at all in sports. We're then going to look at statistical study and research that has been done on this topic. We're going to hear from some NBA players and coaches on playing in Denver and whether or not it affects them. And then finally, we're going to piece everything together and then determine whether or not Denver truly has an unfair advantage. If you ever find yourself in Denver and you want to go see a Nuggets game and you need some tickets, by now you should know where to get those tickets. SeatGeek is the best place for anyone to buy tickets. SeatGeek does not benefit from an unfair high altitude advantage, but they do benefit from the advantage of being an aggregate site, which means they can compare prices from other ticket selling websites and show you what the best deal is possible for each individual seat, for each concert, for each game, whatever. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, or if you live in North America or Canada and you think eventually you're gonna go into some sort of concert or event or sports game, you should definitely download SeatGeek right now. You can use my promo code MDJ for $20 off of your first purchase. Okay, let's first talk about why altitude matters at all in sports, because science. Human beings need oxygen to survive. In fact, we can't be deprived of oxygen for more than a couple minutes without dropping dead. When we're exercising, specifically when we're doing aerobic exercises, so any sort of endurance work, our body becomes even more desperate for oxygen, which is why you breathe heavier when you're exercising. The higher up you go in the atmosphere, the less oxygen there is. Although that's usually not the reason why people have trouble breathing at high altitudes. I mean, yes, it is true that the higher up you go, the less oxygen there is, but that only comes into effect when you go really high up. If you're at about 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters above sea level, which is roughly Denver's altitude, the oxygen level in the air is basically the same as it is on sea level. The air is still about 20.9% oxygen, but it can still feel much harder to breathe up there because of atmospheric pressure. So the higher up you go, the less dense the air is, which makes it harder for your lungs and blood to absorb oxygen. Many athletes, especially endurance athletes, so long distance runners, will purposely train in high altitudes to increase the difficulty of their workouts, and there's a good amount of research supporting the positive benefits that high altitude training can have for athletes. Many military training programs also have their recruits do high altitude training. This high altitude training is also sometimes called hypoxic training. Hypoxic meaning a deficiency in oxygen. With modern technology, athletes can now do hypoxic training at sea level through machines that limit their oxygen input. In fact, some NBA athletes routinely do hypoxic training as part of their conditioning. Now, you might be wondering at this point, well, how high do you have to go for altitude to matter? Because clearly, let's say you're on sea level and then you just go 10 meters above sea level, you're not going to be able to detect the difference. Well, the first thing to note is that this varies a lot between individuals. Based on how well conditioned you are, as well as your genetics, you may not be as affected by altitude as others. In general, however, we can say this. When it comes to athletics and endurance training, anywhere above 1,200 meters or 4,000 feet is sufficient to produce noticeable changes. In fact, when it comes to hypoxic training, there's an upper limit as to how high you want to go for your conditioning. I mean, try running a mile on Mount Everest. You can't. It's physically impossible. You're going to die. Most of the research, therefore, on hypoxic training and sports performance at high altitude has been conducted between 1,200 meters and 2,400 meters. This brings us to Denver, Colorado. Denver is not the highest city in America, it's not the highest place, but out of all cities in the US that have a major sports team, it is the highest. Denver sits at about 1,500 meters above sea level or 5,000 feet. 1,500 meters is just a tad shy of a mile, which is why Denver is also referred to as the Mile High City. If we just look at NBA teams, we see that Denver is the highest, but closely behind Denver is Salt Lake City, home of the Utah Jazz, at 1,300 meters or 4,200 feet. and then there is a significant drop-off. New Orleans is the lowest city. In fact, most of New Orleans is actually below sea level, which is one reason why the area has historically had many flooding issues. Here we begin to see why people think Denver may have an unfair advantage. Although it is interesting that people don't bring it up with Utah all that often. I'm guessing because Salt Lake City doesn't advertise themselves as the Mile High City, and also Salt Lake City doesn't have as many sports teams as Denver does. Anyways, the basic argument behind Denver or Utah having an unfair advantage is that their players spend most of their year living in these areas. They're much more used to exercising in high altitudes. A study from the University of Colorado demonstrated that athletes who are used to training at sea level have a 10% reduction in absorbed oxygen when training in Denver and a 20% reduction in the time it takes for them to be exhausted to failure. The argument is not so much that Denver athletes have better endurance because of the hypoxic environment, although that's probably true on average, but more so that they're just accustomed to it. NBA players from other cities are not, and when they fly into Denver for their away game, they're slammed in the face with this unusual environment. Their bodies have to adjust to something the home team athletes don't, and the reverse is not true. So athletes who are used to high altitudes don't have any trouble performing at low altitudes. So it's a good argument, it's grounded in scientific theory and research, but does it actually hold up? Well, in 2017, statisticians Lopez, Matthews, and Ballmer set out to investigate randomness in sports, and as part of their study looked at home court advantage in all 4 major American sports leagues, the NBA, MLB, NFL, and NHL. What they found was that for all 4 leagues, home court advantage existed, but it was the strongest in basketball. In fact, even the NBA team with the weakest home court advantage, the Brooklyn Nets, had a bigger home court advantage than any other team in any other league. But would you know it, the NBA team that won the most amount of their games at home, the NBA team that had the biggest home court advantage throughout history, the Denver Nuggets. And second, the Utah Jazz. And when you plot all the teams on a graph, you see that most of the NBA teams are quite clustered, with the Nuggets and Jazz being noticeably better at home. But then, here's where it gets even more interesting. The NFL team with the biggest home court advantage, the Denver Broncos. Granted, it was close between them and the Patriots and Seahawks, and with the Seahawks, it could even be explained by their famously loud and rowdy home crowd, but again, Denver is up top. Now, hockey was different. Denver does have a hockey team, the Colorado Avalanche, but they were 7th in the league in home court advantage, and last but not least, they looked at baseball. It is a sport where home court advantage appears the least important, but where Denver's advantage seems the greatest. The Colorado Rockies rank far and ahead, better than the other teams when it comes to home court advantage. In fact, they rank even better than some hockey teams. In their paper, Lopez and colleagues speculate that this trend with Denver sports teams being great at home is related to the city's famous altitude. This type of statistical study is only correlational, which means it can tell you that this phenomenon exists. It can tell you that Denver teams appear to be much better at home than teams in other cities, but it has nothing to say with what causes this. Although high altitude does seem to be the best and possibly only logical explanation as to why Denver has this noticeable advantage at home. We also have a lot of anecdotal evidence from athletes playing in Denver. Shaq once admitted that he used to foul shave when playing in Denver. Now, foul shave is essentially committing unnecessary fouls just to get a breather or to sit on the bench.
Going to Denver, Shaq, we know playing there, you get tired the first quarter.
Speaking of Denver, I used to foul shave in Denver.
Well, explain that. In the first quarter only? Or the whole game, Shaq?
The whole game, because I used to be so tired I couldn't breathe. I just used to get 3 quick fouls. Feels like, I know what you're doing. I was like, yeah, I'm foul shaving. I ain't running up in all this.
Because of the altitude?
Oh, man, boy. I used to be struggling.
David Lee and Steph Curry talked about adjusting to Denver's altitude in 2013 when the Warriors and the Nuggets met in the first round of the playoffs. According to them, it's most noticeable in the first and third quarters when you get out of breath sooner than usual, but after a while, you get a little more used to it. There's also specific conditions that get triggered in high altitudes. Asthma is one of the most common physical conditions, surprisingly common amongst professional athletes, and asthma gets a lot worse in high altitudes. There's also the story of Ryan Clark, a very accomplished NFL safety who has sickle cell, a rare condition that makes it legitimately dangerous for him to play at high altitudes. In 2007, he tried playing against the Broncos in Denver, but then suffered a season-ending illness right afterwards, an illness that saw him lose 30 pounds, and he never once played in Denver again. Out of all 4 major sports, basketball is the sport that is the most aerobic. It's the sport that requires the most amount of endurance, especially for players who play 30 to 40 minutes per game. Given that, it's easy to see why the hypoxic environment of high altitude matters. But high altitude has another effect, which probably explains why we see the advantage in baseball, a sport that is much less aerobic or endurance-based, and that is the thinning of the air. As mentioned earlier in this video, the higher up you go, the less dense the air is, which is why it's harder to absorb oxygen, but it also means things travel faster through the air when you're up there. So in baseball, it has long been known, probably before the science even came out, that it's easier to hit home runs in Denver. And that's been supported by the data, where both home teams and away teams hit more runs in Denver than other cities. Now the funny thing is that the Colorado Rockies have attempted to address this issue by storing their baseballs in a more humid room so that the balls become less dry and thus harder to hit. But their home court advantage still exists, very noticeably. Even if players on both teams take advantage of the thin air and hit more home runs, one team is still much more accustomed to predicting how that ball travels in the different atmosphere, and that's just one of potentially many things that make it easier for Colorado's home team. Matt Prater, who is a kicker in the NFL, currently holds the record for the longest field goal in NFL history. Guess where he broke that record? That's right, in Denver. The thin air definitely made it easier to kick a ball further. Although, high altitude may not be the only thing that explains Denver's advantage, at least in the NBA. So in addition to being the highest city in the NBA, Denver is also the most isolated. If you plot NBA teams on the map, Denver is pretty distant from most other teams. Denver and Utah are also the only 2 teams that share the GMT-6 time zone. Denver's airport is also quite far from the Nuggets arena and far from the hotel the visiting team stays at, something that Greg Popovich has mentioned when asked about why it is harder to play in Denver. The way the NBA schedule works, teams on the East Coast often arrive at Denver after they do their West Coast road trip. In other words, more often than not, teams arrive at Denver already fatigued from a road trip. Now, this is not news to the NBA. Owners and coaches have been complaining about this for decades, and the NBA has taken some actions to rectify this. In recent years, they've intentionally made Denver more often the first stop on a road trip to reduce the fatigue of away teams, and they've also reduced the chance of Denver being the second of back-to-back road games. But this is not a resolved issue. Some opposing teams want the NBA to crack down even harder on the Nuggets' advantage and make road games there easier, while Denver maintains that further intervention from the NBA would be unfair and unjust. According to Nuggets head coach Mike Malone, it's been a point of contention to where they've cut it down. So yes, Denver has a unique advantage in many different ways. The question is this unfair? And technically, yeah, it is absolutely 100% unfair. So what? Professional sports has never been fair. Yes, it's not fair that Denver has this high altitude. It's also not fair that New York and LA teams get to play in bigger markets and attract more free agents. It's not fair that the Miami Dolphins aren't used to playing in cold or snowy weather, even though they're required to since the NFL playoffs occur during the winter every year. But these factors are much less important than the quality of players, of coaching, less important than chemistry, less important than management. For all the good high altitude has done for Denver sports teams, the Nuggets have yet to win a championship in 50 years. They've only made the finals once, back in 1976. The Colorado Rockies have never won a World Series. The Denver Broncos have had success throughout their history, but not nearly as much as New England or Pittsburgh. So yes, Denver does have an advantage in sports. And it is unfair because they didn't technically earn it. But the advantage is not so great as to make it unfair in any meaningful way. At least not in the context of professional sports, where fairness is simply a manufactured illusion intended to keep the players and fans happy. And on that note, I will see you next video.